So this lecture is about naturalism and realism in performance. So you probably already know something about naturalism or realism, or certainly I'm guessing you will have heard those terms or used those terms, particularly realism, which you'll see we've got as a lowercase r here. It's quite a generic term applied to lots of different forms, but it comes specifically out of a movement called naturalism. That's why we normally use the uppercase N. So in this lecture, I want to speak a bit about these two forms, their history, and also what they mean for us now. But I want to start with this. So what are we looking at here? So we're looking at, we would assume, some kind of photograph. Actually, it's the first kind of photography, a kind of image called a daguerreotype. So it's not made the way we make digital images or even the way an old-fashioned analog camera would make images. This is a daguerreotype, so it's a silver plate onto which chemicals are applied that etch away the silver and leave this image. So this is actually one of the first daguerreotypes ever taken. This is one of the first photographs, if you like, in the world. 1846, this photograph was made, this daguerreotype, and it was commissioned by this man, a surgeon called William Morton. So why start with this daguerreotype? Why start with this 19th century context? We've got here in the late 19th century the seeds of naturalism. And those seeds of naturalism, they emerge at the same point as the seeds of modern medicine. So this isn't just a photograph or a daguerreotype. This is a photograph of the first operation under anaesthetic, kind of anaesthetic called ether. So a pretty blunt instrument, not quite as sensitive as the kind of anaesthetics you or I might have administered today. And this man, William Morton, is at the forefront of that new technology, anesthesiology or anaesthetics. And this is one of the first operations, or is a photograph restaged of one of the first operations conducted under ether in 1846. Naturalism and Victorian medicine have a particular set of relationships, and in fact theatre, in the sense of theatrical performances and playhouses, have a connection with anatomy theatres, such as this space here, going back even before the mid to late 19th century. So the first playhouses were probably built, we think, in the 1400s or 1500s, late 1400s, early 1500s in London. And those playhouses were built on the model of anatomy theatres such as this, which pre-existed them by several hundreds of years. And in actual fact, scholarship suggests that the practice of buying your ticket to go to a theatre that those early playhouses were exploiting in that Elizabethan and then later early Jacobean period, that practice of paying your ticket actually came from here, from the anatomy theatre. Visiting anatomy theatres to watch operations, and more specifically to watch necropsy, so to watch operations on dead bodies, was, if you like, a kind of quasi-leisure pastime. So the operating theatre and the theatre that we study here have this kind of coterminal history. And in this particular moment, late 19th century, very interesting things start to happen in both of them. So this anatomy space becomes the home of this burgeoning and exciting new science of anesthesiology, and then also of antiseptic medicine, looking through Lister and Pasteur in particular. So starting to do operations and managing to keep the people alive after the operations. And as that is burgeoning in these theatres, so too is a new form emerging in the playhouse theatres of naturalism. Now we tend to think and we tend to describe as scholars naturalism as a phenomenon, a genre, a movement across many forms of art, and beginning in theatre in the late 19th century, about the same time as these first photographs are being taken and these first operations are being conducted with anaesthetic. Pause that little story there for a moment, and I want us now to look at a more contemporary example of something we might call realism. So one of the one of the examples of where this development is leading and where it may be now. So this is a very short scene from a film written by the playwright James Graham. So James Graham has had a lot of premieres at the Theatre Royal Plymouth here, but this is from a film written by James Graham called X plus Y.
Don't run in the corridor. Excuse me. Excuse me.
Oh, that's subtle. Really subtle.
What? We're not doing anything.
Why not? Give me that now. Is this drums? Go on, piss off. So lucky.
Mr. Humphries.
Yep.
Can I have a quick word?
So what's going on here in this clip? I would say this is an example of realism. Specifically, we've got here a piece of film, and film does a particular kind of realism, but actually we can see many of the traits that we would expect to find in realism on the stage, or indeed any other art form. So often we don't really think very much about what those traits or characteristics might be, but let's stop for a moment and slow down and think what they are. What makes me say that is an example of realism? Well, we might say it looks a little bit like reality. It looks a little bit like a school I went to. This person looks a little bit like a teacher. Everything looks a little bit like, or feels a little bit like. We call that quality a quality of verisimilitude. So the thing represented looks a lot like the thing it represents, or sounds a lot like, or feels a lot like. Verisimilitude, we say. So it has this kind of strong sense of verisimilitude, which we don't necessarily find in other genres. But realism, it's the stock in trade of realism. Also, it seems to conform to the kind of rules or expectations we have about our own reality. So gravity applies, gods and demons don't suddenly appear, we don't suddenly jump back in time. All of these traits of other stylistic forms and genres that signal to us or take us away from this sense of verisimilitude, realism tends to not use those conventions, although of course there are exceptions. So we could kind of boil this down to a very ancient theory of dramatic art. It comes from Aristotle, from his Poetics, which is an ancient Greek text specifically on the dramatic form of tragedy, but has been taken as a paradigmatic text for theatre and the dramatic art more generally. So you might have heard before, or if not, you're going to hear now, about something that Aristotle describes as the Three Unities. So he says that dramatic theatrical form, specifically of tragedy, but it's something that comes into naturalism and realism, describes those forms that generally adhere to these three unities. So a unity of time, place, and action. So time, a unity of time. All of the action of the play takes place within a limited time frame. Ideally, Aristotle says, not more than one day. Now, relatively few dramas in the realist form conform to that idealistically. So you do certainly get plays where all of the action of the play unfolds in real time. But they're fairly uncommon. But what is very common is that we have the sense of them unfolding in real time. So this story, X plus Y, we're looking at here in this little scene from it, it unfolds in real, linear time. So the sense of time we get is the same as the sense of time we have as we go about our daily business, as I lecture to you now and as you watch it. We have a sense that this form is mirroring our experience of time, even if this form actually kind of compresses it or elongates it in quite subtle ways. Unity of place. So again, Aristotle would say the perfect unity or unification of the form would be where all of the action of the play occurs in one place or in one location. So again, there are certain dramas that you can probably think of, certain plays that do conform to that. All of the action is happening in this room. Think like a 12 Angry Men type format. Everything is happening in that room where the jury deliberates, or any other story we might care to think of. Even though most maybe don't conform strictly to that one place, they probably conform to it more broadly. So everything that's happening in this particular play is happening in the state of Denmark, for example, or is happening in Scotland, or is happening in a middle-class home in Norway. So there's a unification of the place. We don't suddenly jump here, there, and everywhere around the world, although sometimes in realism we do break those rules. Action. Now this is the one that Aristotle really holds strongly to, and what he's really bequeathed to theatre since ancient Greece, and then even more so from the 19th century onwards. This idea that all of the action of a play contributes towards one plot. So this idea you may have heard described as the narrative arc, or the character journey. What we're really talking about is the plot of the play, that events precede one another in a logical order. So I do something now, I load my gun now, in order that I can shoot a character in the next act. You know, each of the events leads towards this one single story. That's Aristotle's kind of perfected form. Now you will have heard of this convention of the subplot, if you like, and that's a kind of complication of this. But almost all realist dramas and naturalist dramas hold to this pretty closely. That actually they have one plot, one story, and all of the events in the action of that drama drive that story towards its conclusion. Maybe stop for a moment and just think about some plays you've seen or films you've seen that you would think of as being realist or naturalist, however you currently understand it. Think about the story and its shape and structure. If those events are unfolding in linear time and driving each other onwards in the telling of this one story, that's a kind of key hallmark, a kind of exemplification of the naturalist or realist form, often not occurring in other styles and genres of performance, although they might. So this idea of the unities traces back to the Poetics, and as I said, it refers particularly to tragedy. Now this is interesting because the naturalist dramas of the 19th century, which we're going to come on and have a look at now more specifically, they're almost all tragedies, although they are not necessarily tragedies in the classical sense. They're social tragedies, or they are about the tragic lives of individuals lived within society. If we think of any kind of classic naturalist drama of this period, the late 19th century, it contains some pretty high stakes tragic stuff. And even when we take that through into realism and its kind of transformation into this more contemporary genre, if you think about plays you've seen that you would feel fall under this genre of realism, they look pretty much like my life, they have a strong degree of verisimilitude. Usually the story contains some pretty high stakes, some pretty bad things happening to people, or some pretty serious threats hunting people. And all of this we can kind of take back a bit to tragedy. Tragedy is an imitation of an action that is complete and whole, says Aristotle. So the plot, being an imitation of an action, must imitate one action, and that a whole. The structural union of the parts being such that if any one of them is displaced or removed, the whole will be disjointed and disturbed. For a thing whose presence or absence makes no visible difference is not an organic part of the whole. So it's a very analytical way of looking at the structure of dramas, but there are a couple of things we might want to pick up on here. So this idea of imitation of an action. Now the ancient Greeks in their drama and in their philosophy were fascinated with this idea of imitation. Their word for it was a mimesis, from which we get mimetic or mime, to mime something. Mimesis, imitation. The idea that this drama was imitating real life. And that's a fundamental conceit of naturalism and realism. And it's not only a conceit, it's an ideological assertion that this drama is imitating real life, that real life could be this way, or real life is this way, and the drama is offering an imitation of it. And therefore it needs to conform in some sense to these unities and this sense of a one driving plot in order to be a faithful imitation and an organic part of the whole. So these two other unities, this is action, we talk about time and place, they're primarily inventions of later playwrights and scholars in a period we call the neoclassical period in the 17th century. So Aristotle did refer to them, but really he was really interested in action and drama, action as the basis for drama. Today, I'd say, in the 21st century, and probably since the latter part of the 20th century, realism has been the dominant form in theatre and in probably all audiovisual or dramatic arts. That makes it what we would call the hegemonic form. So the hegemonic form, the predominant influence as of a state, region, group over another or others. So we tend to see realism and think about realism as the given state of performance, the natural state. That's what performance is. All other genres, whatever we may care to think of, postmodern performance, post-structuralist ideas, surrealistic ideas, abstract ideas, that they are all somehow deviations from this norm. Now that's quite a powerful ideological idea. It's actually neither true nor untrue, but what matters is that it maintains this hegemonic position. So we, in our culture or cultures in this 21st century globalized world, realism appears to us as what a man called Colin Counsell, a theorist called Colin Counsell, described as a style without style. It presents itself as a perfect imitation of reality, a style without style. But there's something deceptive in this premise. Émile Zola. You might have heard of Émile Zola, author of, amongst other things, Thérèse Racan, a very famous naturalist novel. So naturalism is really a literary form. Naturalism comes out of the work of authors first, like Zola, who are starting to innovate with this idea of this imitation of a particular brand of reality, Thérèse Racan. And he was asked, if you don't know the story, it's about two adulterous lovers who take up with each other, and after having dispatched with everybody else in order for them to now live and be together, they realise that they hate one another instead of love one another and start plotting to kill one another. And in the kind of denouement and its climax, they both realise at that moment, as they're sitting there with the aged mother of Thérèse Racan, deaf and blind, next to them, that they're actually both just about to try and kill the other one. It's described as a kind of dark and seedy, distasteful view of unseemly, seedy society. Really influential story, Thérèse Racan. And Zola said, when asked, well, how did you write it? Or more often, why did you write it? Why did you write such a distasteful, disgusting tale? He said, I simply applied to two living bodies the analytic method that surgeons apply to corpses. I simply applied to two living bodies the analytic method that surgeons apply to corpses. Now, if you want to understand the genre of naturalism and its emergence in the 19th century in theatre, in the Western world, in the European world, this is the methodology through which it emerges. The analytic method that surgeons apply to corpses. Let's pause that there and have a look at an example of one of these naturalist dramas. So it's a classic of the genre, Ibsen's A Doll's House.
see Mr. Krogstad, please? Yes, on the top floor.
Oh. Dear. Come in. Mrs. Helmer. Go downstairs for a few minutes, will you, son? I won't be long.
I couldn't stop him, Mr. Krogstad. I fought for you as hard as I could, but it was no use.
I've been thinking about you all day, Mrs. Helmer. You see, even debt collectors and hack journalists and people like me still have some traces of what we call feelings.
Then show some. Think of my children.
Have you and your husband ever thought about mine? Not that it matters. Look, you needn't take all this too seriously. I'm not intending to lay any charges against you for the time being.
No, I didn't think you would.
There's no need for anyone to know anything about it. I mean, the whole thing could be settled quite amicably between the three of us.
No, my husband must never know anything about this.
Well, how'd you propose to stop him finding out? Well, perhaps you're in the position to pay me the balance now.
No, not right away.
Or perhaps you've some means of finding the money over the next few days.
No way I'd care to use.
In any case, it wouldn't make any difference. However much money you offered me, you'll never get me to part with that contract.
Why? What use is it to you?
I just want to keep it, to have it in my hand. No outsider will ever know anything about it. So, if you were considering some desperate plan,
I am.
like running away from home,
I am.
or something worse than that,
How do you know?
forget it.
How do you know what I'm thinking?
We all think about that at the beginning. I did. But I didn't have the courage.
Neither have I.
No. You haven't got the courage either, have you?
No, I haven't.
Well, there'll probably be some slight domestic crisis when your husband reads my letter, but you'll
What letter?
soon... Well, the letter I sent him,
Telling him about it?
as euphemistically as possible.
I must read that letter, get it back. I'll get hold of the money somehow.
Don't seem to understand, Mrs. Helmer. I don't want money.
What do you want?
I'll tell you what I want. I want to get back, and I want to get on, and your husband's going to help me. I've been there a year and a half now, and I've been a model employee. And all that time, I've been living in the most abject poverty, as you can see. I was quite happy to work my way up, step by step. Not anymore, though. Not since I was kicked out. It's not enough for me anymore just to be getting my job back, as if it was some great favor. I want promotion. My husband's going to have to create a new post for me.
He'll never do that.
Oh, yes, he would. I know him. He wouldn't dare raise a murmur. And once we're working together, you'll see what'll happen. Within a year, I'll be the manager's right-hand man. It'll be Niels Krogstad and not Torvald Helmer who'll be running the joint stock bank.
Oh, you'll never manage it.
You're not going to...
I do have the courage now.
You can't frighten me.
You'll see.
People don't do things like that, Mrs. Helmer. In any case, it wouldn't be any use. I'd still have your husband exactly where I want him.
What afterwards, even
You
if...
seem to forget. I own your reputation.
Your reputation. I own your reputation. So this is what keeps coming up in this naturalist drama of this period. Reputation and suicide. The two things that are being discussed in this pivotal scene of A Doll's House. So some of you may know this drama, some of you may not. If you don't, this is a pivotal moment in the plot. There is one plot. Aristotle would love it. And the plot of A Doll's House follows Nora, this woman, a Norwegian housewife of good standing in society, and her husband Torvald, the Helmers. Torvald works in a bank, and they live very comfortably with their 3 small children. We learn that some years earlier, Torvald's health has failed, and he was given strict medical advice to convalesce in a warmer climate. The family had no means to fund this, and so Nora forges her husband's signature on a loan agreement in order to obtain funds. The plan works. The money is secured, Torvald is able to recuperate, and Nora keeps this secret from her sick husband. When we join the play, Nora's husband has just been made director of a bank, and one of his first acts is to fire an employee, this man, Niels Krogstad, who's been working very hard in a lowly clerical position to atone for his crime. His crime? He once forged a signature on a loan agreement. We learn that Nora secured this loan from Krogstad Following Krogstad's dismissal from the bank, he is blackmailing Nora with the knowledge of her forgery. Krogstad, who lives in these financial dire straits with his family, demands that Nora get her husband to rehire him and promote him, as we've just heard at the bank. He wants to get on, he keeps saying. Nora is terrified of the social shame of her crime. And she's adamant, as we can see, that her husband must never know. And in the play's dramatic denouement, Krogstad delivers this letter that he's speaking about, in which he tells Torvald Helmer the full details of the crime. And Torvald reads it and flies into a rage with Nora. She's ruined him. She's ruined his reputation. She's ruined her reputation. He's not the woman she thought she was. He's in a fit of pique. When Krogstad retracts this threat and says, I won't use this, here's the loan agreement back and the forgery, I won't tell anybody, Torvald is overjoyed and he comforts Nora and he says that now everything can return to normal and she can go back to being his Skylark, his pet name for her. However, Nora has been shocked to the core by her husband's unsympathetic response and by the fact that the fear of that social shame was greater than any affection he may have borne her. And in the conclusion of this play that was outrageous in its moment, in its late 19th century moment, so outrageous that Ibsen had to rewrite it for the German stage because it couldn't be staged in Germany with this ending, Nora walks out on her husband and children. She says, now I've got the courage to do it, and she goes. Utterly shocking conclusion. Bearing in mind what we've heard so far about this naturalist method, what Zola said, I simply applied to two living beings the analytic method that surgeons apply to corpses. Let's consider how that methodology might describe the process that Ibsen is using to generate this drama. So we can see that it has that strong mimetic sense of verisimilitude, that imitation of action, that it seems like real life, that it all follows this one action, this one plot driving towards its conclusion. But there's also a sense here of this analytic method of two bodies. Now, in analysis, in scientific analysis, what the surgeon is looking to do on that corpse is open that corpse and observe objectively what may have caused it to die. So that whole process of autopsy is about observing, peeling away the outer layers of the flesh in order to observe what's actually gone on underneath. So the analytic method, the scientific method, presents itself as one of objective analysis. And that's what Zola's saying he's doing. I'm just objectively observing what happens to people in our society. And that's the same method that Ibsen is pursuing here. Except, think about that first image we looked at, that image of the operation under ether. Part of the reason it's necessary to anaesthetize somebody if you're going to cut them open is you can't cut them open if they're not still. So the only way that analytic scientific method can work on the body is if you first knock out that body, you anaesthetize that body. Once surgeons discovered they could do that, they could start opening up the body and looking inside, but the moment they open it up, they let everything else in. All those inner surfaces of the body that need protecting from bacteria are now exposed to bacteria. And it's not until people like Lister and Pasteur start to develop antiseptic methods that surgery even works at all. Because as soon as you open something up to look inside, you let the outside in. So if we think about that application of the method in drama, we could think about that fourth wall as if it were the epidermis of the body, the upper layer of the skin. That what naturalists claim to be doing or seek to do is to kind of slide away that fourth wall, that convention, move away that side of that living room in Norway, in the middle-class family home, and just watch. Let's just watch. And all of the stylistic traits, the style without style, tell us that we're just watching. That's all that's happened. We've moved that wall away. But as soon as they move that wall away, of course, they're letting certain things in. Their bias, their own personal perspective, their political or ideological views and values start to influence that thing. So this story might present itself as being a story that could be about anybody in that society. But of course, in reality, it's not. It's a carefully chosen and selected story by somebody with a political agenda. So Ibsen has a very strong feminist agenda, undoubtedly. And he is telling the story of this woman in a particular way. And by laying claim to its naturalness, so not by telling it through a kind of artificial edifice that already says to you, this is made up, this is symbolic, this is not real, by telling it through that style without style set of traits, it makes it politically a much more potent weapon, because it presents itself as that objective, analytical observation of society, instead of being a very particular and specific observation of that society, made with very particular ends in mind. Theatre as a slice of life. We're all very familiar, I think, with this saying, which I believe comes from Zola, or seems to come directly from Zola. Certainly comes from this period, late 19th century period, so a couple of decades after that operation with anaesthetic, that first operation. Theatre as a slice of life. This idea that we're slicing just like a surgeon might slice with a scalpel. We slice open the body politic, to the body of the group, the body of society. The surgeon deals with my body or your body, and the dramatist deals with the body of society, our collective body. And what these naturalists are saying is, I can take a slice of it, I'll show you what its inner character is like, this slice of life. So part of its political efficacy comes from the fact that it presents itself as just being life, not being mediated by style. Although, of course, it is all of these things about imitation, that dramatic plot, those conventions of verisimilitude. They are all, of course, conventions. They are styles, albeit a style without style. So naturalism and realism are highly politically charged, and in this period are particularly interested in the role of women in society. Let's just take a look at this from a slightly different perspective before we conclude. So Groucho Marx. So this is a 20th century silent comic film star, the Marx Brothers, you may or may not have heard of, and Groucho Marx. So he wrote in one of his letters to a friend, I've become a very regular fan of the theatre, and I think it's a great idea. I don't know if you've witnessed any of it, but you know how we go to a picture theatre and see pictures of actors on the screen? Well, you won't believe it, Arthur. But here in New York, they have real people up here on the stage. Why, you could almost talk to them. It's uncanny. I don't think it will ever replace the movies, but it certainly strikes a new note in American art. For example, I saw I Am a Camera last night, the John Van Druten play, and Julie Harris, she plays, I guess they call it the lead in the theatre. You could see the scratches on her legs. At first, I thought it had something to do with the plot, and we waited for these scratches to come to life. But Arthur, it was never mentioned in the play. And we finally come to the conclusion that either she had been shaving too close or she had been kicked around the dressing room by her boyfriend. Now, honestly, could anything like this happen in the movies? Think of it. Here you see a girl's real scratches. It was great fun. Now, Groucho Marx he's making a joke here, obviously. He's using a kind of ironic tone. He's acting as if the theatre is the newer art form and it's taking its precedent from the movies. But we can see in his joke and in his irony, some interesting things start to show up about that realist form in theatre. So in effect, all he's kind of pointing out, if you like, is that it's harder to control the spectacle in theatre than it is on film. And if we see something out of control in film, we immediately know that it's bad continuity. It hasn't been done right. We know that film's not working, that realist genre is not holding. But in theatre, the genre itself is always in this oscillation, this fluctuation between being read as real and being read as stylized. And the genre of realism that emerges out of naturalism, which is obsessed with this scientific, analytic approach, that genre is always oscillating between this reality and this representational capacity. And as he's saying in this, even within his ironic tone, there's something electrifying about that, or something potent and powerful about that, that ambiguity, that ambivalence about whether or not this is being represented or real. Now, there are a couple of different ways to think about this in realism and in naturalism. And one useful way is to come back to this man, Colin Counsell, who coined this term, the realism as the style without style, and to think about what he calls the abstract register and the concrete register. So he says the abstract register, this suppresses the practical function of phenomena in favour of a symbolic or signifying role. And it is therefore bound up with another place. The stage table represents a general class of objects, tables. The character of theatrical realism becomes a fully rounded individual. You probably heard this phrase, fully rounded. The character was three-dimensional. It is the very quality of symbolic transposition that enables it to be illusionistic. Nice sentence. The stage becomes another place, and its objects become things of the play's world. The person is not an actor, but King Lear. So in one sense, Counsell is saying something that we take for granted. He's kind of pointing out and describing something that we're very well habituated to doing, to reading things in this abstract register. That's what Groucho Marx is doing. He sees the scratches on the actress's legs, and he tries to figure out, well, symbolically, what do they mean? What's their function in this drama? He's trying to read them through the abstract register. Realism has become so hegemonic in our encounter with art and our consumption of art that we don't even notice this is a register. We don't even notice that we're doing something creative simply by trying to read things as abstracted. And what is the word Counsell uses to describe this function? The abstract register. That's an interesting choice of words. So he's saying even in this supremely real genre of realism, in actual fact the register is abstracted, just as in the way we would read any other representational act. Now he contrasts this with another register called the concrete register, but to try and understand where this thing sits, let's go to another man, Keir Ilham, The Semiotics of Theatre and Drama. He says the very fact of an object's appearance on stage suppresses the practical function of phenomena in favour of a symbolic or signifying role. A table deployed in dramatic representation will not usually differ in any material or structural fashion from the item of furniture that the members of the audience eat at, and yet it is in some sense transformed. It acquires, as it were, a set of quotation marks. I love this way of thinking about theatre, this set of quotation marks. Everything that comes out on stage, somehow its practical function, as Ilham has it, is suppressed. So we don't look at those scratches on the legs and think, oh, where have they come from? Has she cut herself on the way onto the stage? We think, well, what's the character done there? What's happened to the character, not what's happened to the actress? Everything, as it were, in a set of quotation marks. But of course, realism, everything is within those quotation marks, but realism is seeking to hide those quotation marks too. The concrete register. So here the person on stage is recognised as an actor, and the table as that table. The register does not function symbolically, as its stage is not differentiated from the real social space-time of the audience. Thus it deals not in systematised symbolic categories, but in the real material stage. Manufacturing no illusion, its mechanics and fictionality can be admitted within the performance. That is, artifice must be accounted for in our interpretation of the performance. We must make sense not merely of the told, but also of the telling. That's the other side of Marx's comment. This realization, hang on, this does not fit within the imagined plot, within the imitation of action. There's nothing, it doesn't fit there. This is from another realm. This is real. This is the actor's scratches, not the character's scratches. These two registers are operating in every single form of theatre we can imagine, every single genre we can imagine. But realism is doing a very complex thing, and also a thing potentially quite political and sinister. So it is operating in an entirely abstract realm, or seeking to operate in that abstract realm, where everything is being moved from its concrete form to its abstract form. And yet it is seeking to present that transit as if it is happening in the other direction. As if everything is in fact concrete and real and not representative, is merely a slice of life. Now this has been really beautifully stated by a man called Bert O. States. Great Reckonings in Little Rooms. Great title of the book. That's Shakespeare's description of the death of Marlowe. It strikes a man more dead than a great reckoning in a little room. Marlowe stabbed in a pub, small tavern. Theatre, theatron, derived from to see, is a means of looking objectively at the subjective life of the race as something prepared for the community out of the substance of its own body. Theatre is the medium par excellence that consumes the real in its realist forms. Man, his language, his rooms and cities, his weapons and tools, his other arts, animals, fire and water, even finally the theatre itself. Its permanent spectacle is the parade of objects and processes in transit from environment to imagery. Its permanent process, the transit from environment to imagery. We might just replace that environment and imagery with concrete and abstract. Those are exactly the same things that Colin Council is talking about. This is the nature of theatre. This is what is described as the phenomenological nature of theatre. It's phenomenon, what it means, what it is. That this, as Bert O. States is saying, it is happening in all theatre. This is its raison d'etre and its modus operandi. This is everything about theatre and everything that theatre does. But this movement of naturalism in the 19th century, coming into realism as a hegemonic form that we still feel and experience now as a hegemonic form, it is doing something very unusual in relation to this, in relation to the nature of the being of theatre. Because it is seeming to present itself as a transit in the other direction, as a transit from imagery to environment. That actually this represented space of the stage, this abstract space of the stage, is just standing as a cipher for society, for real life. There's something massively politically efficacious in that. We don't tend to think of realism as political theatre. We almost put it in a very different space. But in actual fact, realism, naturalism, is the most political form of theatre because it is presenting itself not as theatre at all, not as bound by this same rule. Of course it is, but its stylistic trope, its style without style, is doing this very differently. Now, if we watch again this clip of X plus Y, only a minute from this film, I would like you to watch it again, and I would like you to think about whose realism is this? So we think about realism, and we are encouraged by realism to think about it as this form without agenda, as this slice of life, this surgeon's cut or architectural move of this wall out the way so that we can see the objective life of the species, not the subjective life of the species. But whose view is it? Who's doing the cutting? Who's doing the opening up, and what's being let in? So I want you to watch this again and think for yourself and decide whose realism is this? What political values, what social, cultural values are being put forward in this view of a slice of life?
Don't run in the corridor. Excuse me. Excuse me.
Oh, Oh, that's subtle. Really subtle.
What? We're not doing anything.
Why not? Why not? Why not? Why not? Wait, give me that now. Is this drums? Go on, piss off. So lucky.
Mr. Humphries,
Yep.
can I have a quick word?